The Supreme Court on Thursday is going to hear arguments on this assertion by Donald Trump that the 14th Amendment doesn't apply to him. The part that says, the part of the Constitution that says that if you've engaged in insurrection, you can no longer hold public office. Trump is claiming, no, that doesn't apply to me for a bunch of reasons. I'll share those with you. But I have a larger question. What do the rich dudes who own the Supreme Court justices want? And I'll tell you about that in just a minute. I've spoken about this briefly in the past, but I wrote about it yesterday and published it this morning. So also, are Europeans who support Ukraine getting a brutal lesson about American politics? What's going on with this? And did the MAGA convoy, they finally made it to the border, to Texas. Oh my God, what did they discover? I'll tell you all about it. All 18 of them, no, not a single truck. But anyway, I'll tell you how the convoy is going. It's rather tragic. In the second hour of our program, a secretive U.S. right-wing group, that would be ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, has designed a piece of model legislation that would give big business immunity from bad acts. Oh, gee, how thoughtful. We'll talk about that in the second hour of the program. Also, a quick recap of all the ways our legal system is holding Donald Trump accountable. You know, a lot of us have just kind of lost track of which case is which and what law and who and where. And Dick Durbin is still taking blue slips seriously. WTF? I mean, what the heck is going on here? Well, anyway, we'll talk about that in the second hour of the program. In the third hour of our program, 4% of California's population is at risk. 94% of California's population is at risk from this raging atmospheric river. And we'll talk about that. And if you're in California, if you're listening to me right now in California, check the weather. Be very careful. Get ready. Get ready to lose power. Get ready to be a couple days maybe without power or without water. We just went through this here in Oregon, a couple weeks ago with really extreme weather that knocked out power to a large chunk of our city. Or our state for that matter. Also, Connecticut just became the first state to wipe out medical debt for all the people who live in Connecticut. You don't even have to apply for it. I'll tell you about that and what Phil Murphy is doing, or not Phil Murphy, Ned Lamont is the governor of Connecticut, what he's doing with regard to that. But to start out, what's going on here with the Supreme Court? I find this absolutely fascinating. This whole idea that Donald Trump is saying the 14th Amendment doesn't apply. Now, the 14th Amendment is unambiguously clear. I mean, it's how can you not read, that somebody who has engaged in insurrection against the United States or given aid or comfort to those in insurrection can no longer hold public office? How can you not think that would apply to Donald Trump? I mean, this is a guy who encouraged an insurrection, who led it, said, go to the Capitol, I'll go with you. The Secret Service wouldn't let him go, but he certainly wanted to. That this insurrection was intended to murder the Vice President of the United States and the Speaker of the House. They came within minutes of accomplishing that goal. They brought a gallows. And they succeeded in shutting down the confirmation of Joe Biden as president until the next day, until, the early hours of the next morning. Now, how is that not an insurrection? Well, Trump is making basically a couple of claims. He's making, his first claim is that he's not an officer of the United States, because the 14th Amendment says that a member of Congress or an officer of the United States will be barred if they engage in insurrection. So he's saying, I'm not an officer of the United States. Well, history says that presidents have been referred to as officers of the United States over and over and over again throughout history. His second defense is that while the language of the 14th Amendment is clear, that insurrectionists can't hold office, Congress never passed legislation putting it into effect. And Section 5 of the 14th Amendment says Congress may pass a law putting into effect provisions of the 14th Amendment. Well, Congress has passed a number of laws putting into effect some parts of the 14th Amendment. But the argument that you need special legislation to execute a law that says you can't hold office if you're an insurrectionist is kind of silly. It was used hundreds of times after the Civil War. It was used to keep Jefferson Davis from running for president, for God's sake. So, that's a specious argument. His third defense is that January 6th wasn't actually an insurrection. He's saying, no, it was a tourist visit or an interruption of Congress for a few moments or a protest, but not an insurrection. And then his very weak fourth defense is that the 14th Amendment was only intended to be wielded against people who engaged in or who were involved with the Confederacy, and that it no longer applies in the modern era. Now, this group of 25 of the nation's most well-known, prestigious, award-winning, top-of-the-line academic and pop history scholars of the Civil War have filed a friend of the court brief with the Supreme Court saying all four of those arguments are BS, that the fact of the matter is that the presidency is an office of the government. He is an officer of the government, number one. He did engage in what should be called insurrection. The 14th Amendment does not need to be activated. It's already been used, well over 100 times. And that at the time it was written, one of the people who was the author of the 14th Amendment gave a speech in which he said, this is not just for now, this is for future generations. So all four of those arguments are specious. But here's the thing, the Supreme Court can pick any one of those four, or multiple ones of those four, or something else that they could just pull out of their backsides like they did with Bush v. Gore in 2000, and just say, we're going to give the White House to, or we're going to end this prosecution of Donald Trump, or we're going to allow him to be on the ballot, I guess would be the specific and exact way to say it. We're going to allow him to be on the ballot, and if he wins, we're going to allow him to serve as president. So the bottom line here is that the court could arguably or perhaps even legitimately rule in Trump's favor or against Trump. They could either rule, yes, he can stay on the ballot because we agree with one of these 4 points. Or they could say, no, we disagree with all of his 4 points and he can't be on the ballot. But the big question in my mind is why would they make one of those two decisions, assuming that it's a binary choice? There is a third option, and that is that they could rule very narrowly on Colorado and just say, but other states, we're just going to leave it, sort of like the Dobbs decision. We'll leave it up to the states. I think that's very unlikely. But there has been at least one friend of the court brief that has been filed with the Supreme Court begging them not to do that specifically and saying, please, decide this one way or the other so that we can proceed without uncertainty. And that, I believe that was from Dana Nessel in Michigan, the Secretary of State of Michigan. But I could be wrong. But it was one of the high-profile states filed that one. But the question in my mind is not just how are they going to rule, but why. And I say this because we have a number of Supreme Court justices. Alito has been being massaged for years and years by Leonard Leo and all his rich buddies. They've got this little outfit next door to the Supreme Court, kind of a social club now, where he holds court. And Thomas, of course, we know about all the literally millions and millions of dollars worth of vacations and buying his mom's house and sending his kid to prep school, on behalf of Harlan Crow, this one, and others. Apparently there's multiple right-wing billionaires. Another right-wing billionaire bought a bus for Clarence Thomas. We don't know yet who paid off Brett Kavanaugh's gambling debts and whatnot, but they were huge. Amy Coney Barrett's husband is suddenly making piles of money in defending in cases that, well, let's just say exploiting her presence on the Supreme Court. John Roberts' wife has made over $10 million from law firms that routinely have cases. Many of them have cases before the Supreme Court. I mean, this court is just corrupt, or at least the Republicans on the court. There have been no such arguments made about Kagan or Sotomayor or Jackson. But this is the question in my mind is I guarantee you. Well, I can't guarantee it, but I believe that at the very least, Clarence Thomas and probably John Roberts and Sam Alito are getting phone calls from these right-wing billionaire donors who some of whom don't want Trump on the ticket because they think that there's no way he can win. I mean, they're just looking at the polling, and Biden's. I realize right now the polling shows that Trump is beating Biden. I'm not believing it, and I don't think they do either. So, are they going to say to Thomas and Roberts and company on the Supreme Court, are the rich people who own them, who they almost always rule in favor of and have for decades now, are those rich people going to tell them, yeah, we can handle Trump? Fritz Tyson, notwithstanding, Fritz Tyson, of course, in 1933 was the guy who put up the 3 million Reichsmarks, Deutschmarks, that got Hitler into the race, essentially, to become chancellor, and he was the guy who lobbied von Papen to make him chancellor. He wrote a book called I Paid Hitler about how he thought he could control Hitler because he was one of the richest guys in Germany. Didn't work out that way. He and his family had to flee the country. But anyhow, either these rich guys who own the Supreme Court are thinking we can control Trump, in which case the Supreme Court will leave him on the ballot. Or they're thinking, hey, let's get rid of Trump because Nikki Haley has a better chance of beating Biden, which is what the polls show. So, how do you think it's going to play out? Those are my thoughts on that. We'll be right back.